Thank you, Justin. Rebecca and I are longtime colleagues, and we probably think too much alike about too many things, but we'll try and give you the full perspective of what's happening in the media business, which is being hit by two crises, two very different crises, I would argue, at the same time. One is the business model crisis. Print advertising is in steady decline. Digital advertising is being scarfed up by Google and Facebook, and we're left fighting over the crumbs. So that's the business model problem in a sentence. And the other crisis is a credibility crisis, which I would argue existed prior to the last election, but has certainly been exacerbated by the last election and is actively encouraged by the current president of the United States, who refers to both of our organizations as part of the fake news media. And Rebecca, let's start with the second one. I mean, how do you, at the New York Times, and by the way, Rebecca and I haven't talked since she went to the New York Times, so I have lots of those questions, and she'll probably have them for me. But how do you deal with that?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure, and we did not practice much, so this will be a very spontaneous discussion.
We did not practice at all.
I mean, look, there's no question. President Trump has repeatedly called the New York Times the failing New York Times, yet by reporter to reporter, he actually calls the Times for interviews, and Maggie Haberman, our political reporter, quite a bit. So I think he intuitively understands the importance of the press. But there's no question that right now these two threats that you posed are, it's exactly right. There's a business model pressure, and there's also the pressure, quite frankly, over credibility. There's been a lot of discussion about fake news. And I think it's more important than ever that the Times, the Wall Street Journal, Fortune, and other publications kind of redouble our efforts to convince America that we can be trusted news sources. There was a lot of confusion in the election, particularly in the digital world when you look at Facebook and your news feeds and what's out there on social media over what's real news and what's fake news. I think the traditional media bear a little bit of, at least a little bit of responsibility in that, there are a lot of people who don't trust the traditional media. So we now at the Times are redoubling efforts to make sure that we reflect a lot of different points of view, and we're pressuring Facebook and some of the digital players to try to come up with ways to identify what is real news and what is fake news, what is fact, what is not, what's a trusted news source and what isn't.
But we're losing the battle, aren't we? I mean, Donald Trump doesn't have great favorability ratings for a first-year president, but they're better than the news media's ratings.
Well, I would actually disagree a bit. What's been amazing is that, Trump tweets about the failing New York Times, and our subscriptions go up. And I think that finally what's happened in America is something that we in journalism have pined for a long time, is that people have finally realized that you have to pay for quality news. And it's not just the Times, it's the Journal, it's Fortune. I'm on the board of the Columbia Journalism Review. They've had a surge of subscriptions from people who just want to support journalism. This is something that we have waited years for. And last week, the Times reported that in the first quarter, we added 300,000 subscriptions just in the first quarter alone, more than the 3 million mark. That's the most in history. It's more than, I think, 2013 and 2012 combined. So look, I also think that in some ways, in terms of the purpose of journalism, it is almost a spring of journalism. There's almost never been a bigger story. Everything in the world is changing. Every single business policy may be up for grabs. It is the impact on the ground, understanding what's going on, not only with the economies of New York and California, but of course, importantly, in the middle of the country, which is where I'm from. It's never been more important than before. So I think, we can talk about the digital pressures, but I think in a way, the news media has found its footing in ways that would have been unexpected a few months ago.
That's a really interesting perspective, and we ought to probe that a little bit and sort of flesh it out. I mean, what you're saying is definitely true. I've heard from the Washington Post as well, soaring. I was told they set an annual target for digital subscriptions and hit that target in the first quarter. So people are not only reading more, they're paying to read more. And I think all of us kind of know that from our own experience. I mean, for the last year, our offices are now just about a block from here, and I live in Connecticut. And so I started driving rather than having to do the train and the subway thing. And I said, okay, I'm going to survive this by going really early in the morning, and I'll listen to the news in the morning, and then in the evening, I'll do books on tape on the way home. And I made that vow to myself when I started. I'm getting nowhere on my books because, I get in the car and I want to listen to the news again. You say, why? I mean, this is a great show. We've never seen anything like this before. And we're all sort of tuning in and saying, wow. But that said, Rebecca, the people who are subscribing to the New York Times probably don't represent a great political cross-section of the country. You're getting one side, and I suspect not the other.
Well, we're trying to change that. And I do think actually among younger readers, there's a sense that many younger readers who never subscribed to anything before are subscribing. I think we will both be, and all of us be studying, where this is coming from. But I would say that we are seeking at the Times to really try to broaden our base of readers, because it's not a good business. I think all of you run businesses. It's not a good business model to be strong in the coasts and not anywhere in the middle. That doesn't really work. Recently, the New York Times hired Bret Stephens, who's the the deputy editor of the journal's editorial page, and he's been a pretty controversial hire among some of our readers, but we feel that it's very important to be a national newspaper. And I think if there's one lesson that many of us learned from the past election, is that being in our own information bubbles is not that useful. And I think many of us didn't quite realize, particularly whether it's the Times or you're on Facebook, and just like how much of your surroundings really just kind of reinforced worldviews that were in many cases not realistic. And so I think that we have to be committed to reaching across that political spectrum and really earning the trust. I mean, the Times just did this trust ad campaign for the first time ever, and a big part of that is like doing the hard work of not having the reflexive reaction to stories. But it's really hard. It's exhausting, and I think you're right. The news cycle like this, we've never seen anything like it before.
Some questions are starting to come in, and please send in questions, because Rebecca and I would love to make this a conversation and hear what's on your mind, and feel free to attack us and throw things at us, because the President of the United States does, so why shouldn't you? But the bubble effect you were talking about, I mean, two things about that. One is the news media is more diverse than it has ever been before. I mean, people talk about the mainstream media, but I would have known what that meant 2 decades ago. I don't know what that means now. I mean, there are so many diverse news organizations, and people can choose what they want. But we know what they choose. We've all done the headline experiments. We get the data real time. Readers will go to a strong point of view, particularly readers on Facebook, to some extent on Google as well, to a strong, opinionated point of view before they will go to a straight news headline. In fact, you can hardly do a straight news headline in the digital world because it'll just be ignored.
I would disagree slightly with that. I would say that the traffic, to your point about just the riveting show that's going on, the traffic to some of the main stories, the political stories in the Times, is often like in the millions. People are
straight news, right down the middle news
straight
stories.
news, right down the middle news stories. And there are, certainly voices and analysis and this sort of thing, but we're seeing really heavy readership. And I think that, but I think your point is a good one, because the way we are interacting with news is changing. And I'd love to ask you, I mean, you do an email newsletter every morning, And people are getting information in different ways. They're getting it in their inbox. They're getting it, in print. Hopefully, if more than a few of you, they're getting it on. I don't really care how you consume, by the way, the Times or any other, as long as you pay for it. Whatever mode. And I think a lot of people are mixing it up. But it's interesting to me how something like an email newsletter has become a huge way and a very powerful way of delivering news. I mean, every morning when you pick which stories to highlight, you are in a sense endorsing, that story in the Journal, the story in the Times, and giving people, very busy people, a guide to the days of events. And I think that's kind of a fascinating
But in a way, that's part of the bubble effect.
Yeah.
I mean, I like my bubble. It's a great group of, I got about 80,000 readers, and if you're not on there, fortune.com/getCEO daily / and you can be on there. But it's a great conversation, but it's a narrow conversation. I mean, you go back 2 decades or 3 decades. That's why I say I don't know what people mean when they talk about the mainstream media. It was true that there was a pretty small group of people who controlled the information that everybody got. You had the 3 big networks, and you had a couple of important papers, the New York Times being one of them, and you had the AP and the UPI, and they all spent too much time having lunch together, and that was how people got their information. You still try and do that at the New York Times, but I think it's becoming increasingly hard to hit the center of the country. Yeah. We try and do it at Time Magazine and work very hard to keep that balance, but it's very hard. And a lot of people, I mean, we had a session, the CEO of Mike, which is a digital news service that's designed for millennials, met with us right after the election, and he said, young people don't want that. Mm-hmm. The young people want you to take a position. They want you to take a stand, and you will die if you try and walk down the middle. And there are a lot of people who I'm not sure I agree. I mean, my sympathies are with you, but there are a lot of people who feel like that. And we really need to talk about this, and you were saying some interesting things about this before we came in. Technology is exacerbating it.
Right.
Because technology is serving you up things that fit what you've clicked on in the past. It's reinforcing your biases and your views and making the problem worse.
Right. I mean, during the election over the past year, when I was at the Journal, we did a feature and actually won an award for it called Red Feed, Blue Feed, where we would take a day's events and just compare if you were a conservative, the coverage you would see, and if you were a liberal, the coverage you would see. And they were completely opposite. They spoke nothing to each other. And I think you're right that there are a certain number of people, no question, they want voice, they want outrage, and we need to read that. But I think there's also like a middle that really, after the election and realizing that actually what people need to do is talk more to one another, these two sides need to interact more, we need to, instead of dismissing things entirely, like learn these points, learn these perspectives, and it's hard work. But I, maybe naively, but we are giving it we are really committed to trying not to choose one side of this, because to be honest, there are decades of stewardship of the New York Times. It's gone a little right, it's gone a little left, but this is to choose one side is over the long term. That's a pretty risky bet. I mean, what's your thinking at Fortune?
Well, we're still, I mean, Fortune is a little narrower, right? We're speaking to the business community, but Time is where you have a real problem, because it's 3 million people straight across the country. I would suspect that the voter breakdown in the last election of Time Magazine readers was pretty close to the national breakdown, and it's just hard, because increasingly people they only accept things that they read that reinforce their biases. And when you have someone as powerful as the President of the United States reinforcing that by saying, what you read in the New York Times or what you read in Time Magazine is fake news. I mean, fake news is a real problem, which we should talk about at some point, but it's not that. I think it's, look, everyone in this room knows what we're talking about, because if there is any diversity among your friends and your family, you have all been in the situation where you're sitting at a dinner somewhere and a political topic comes up and it's like you're on Mars and Venus.
Yeah.
No, just the basic, there's no basic information for a debate.
Yeah.
People say, really? That's not the way I heard it. I heard it this way.
Yeah. You know, at the Times, we have this podcast called The Daily. I don't know if any of you have listened to it. But it's really been, we only started it about 4 months ago. Michael Barbaro every day tackles a different issue. It's had 27 million downloads, and which is just extraordinary in that amount of time. One of the things they're doing is that they're providing they're seeking to provide balance every day. They're trying to talk to coal miners. They're trying to talk to, they did something on the executions, and they spoke to the mother of a woman who was murdered. There's a young man who is from Alabama, from a very different place than New York City, who every day is kind of, trying to pierce the echo chamber and saying, let's reach across to include these other people. And somehow the voice and listening to people's voice without the filter is something that makes people feel like they can make up their own mind and it's a bit closer. I don't mean to be naive about this, but I think we are seeing some promising signs. Twice a week we're doing like readings from the right, readings for the left, and we've received hundreds, if not thousands, of people who are thankful and interested, because I think it's just gotten to the point where people are like, well, what is going on over there?
What about Facebook and Google? I mean, what could they, should they be doing to help address the problem that they have contributed to?
I think the first thing is to acknowledge there's a problem. I think now Mark Zuckerberg has recently acknowledged that he didn't go into this to become a media platform, but he is one.
He is the most powerful.
He is the most powerful. And I want to talk a little bit about the business challenge facing journalism. 85% of the growth in digital ad spending is going to Facebook and Google. That is an existential threat to Alan and I and any mainstream media that's out there, because basically what Facebook and Google are trying to do is have you go to them for all of the news, and that's a problem if there is no way for them to really sort what is real news and what is fake news.
And that's a big deal, because we used to think, and people used to think, that the challenge that the media faced was making the transition from print to digital.
Yeah.
That the print business model was challenged, and we had to figure out how to disrupt ourselves and move to digital so we could thrive. Well, we're well beyond that. I mean, the New York Times has done amazing things in digital. Rebecca ran the digital operation at the Wall Street Journal. At Time Inc., we now reach 133 million people every month. So, and we produce 1,000 pieces of content every day, the vast majority of which don't go in a magazine. So we've gotten over that hump.
Yeah.
We have become digital. The problem is the digital business model doesn't work very well because Facebook and Google are taking all the money. So, you and I used to talk about the light at the end of the tunnel. No one talks about that anymore. It's just keep tunneling,
Well, I think what's also interesting is that you've probably all read about these cases where trusted brands have ended up having their ads next to terrorist video and racist and or anti-Semitic content. And this is actually really interesting, because it's one of the first times that Google and Facebook have been put on the defensive, because it's a big problem for them if advertisers begin saying, as some have, we are not going to advertise with you if there's a chance that our brand is going to end up next to an ISIS video. And so they're trying to correct this. Last week, Facebook said that it was going to hire 3,000 people to weed through all of the video content and all the content to make sure this doesn't happen. I mean, think about that for a moment. The Times has 1,300 journalists and editors around the world. So they are hiring the biggest news staff in the country, one of the biggest news staffs in the world, just to deal with this issue of advertiser content. So there's a world of issues that I think, and Google faces the same in a way. I think maybe people will come back to trusted content.
I also think there's a lot, a company like Facebook with its technology expertise, if it faces up to the fact that it is the most powerful media company in the country. There's a lot they could do to explicitly address the crisis. There's no
Absolutely.
reason why artificial intelligence can't allow Facebook to do the same thing you or I do when we see a story. You know, the first thing you do is you say, okay, what's the organization behind this story? Do they have standards of verification, of fact checking, of fairness? Do they publish their standards? Do they have a record of only writing on one side of every issue, or do they have a record of writing on both sides of the issue? Is there any evidence in the story that they actually tried to reach out to other people to get verified? I mean, and we know. We also look at the byline and say, does this reporter have a history of writing fairly on this subject, or they only write on all those things? There's certainly a way to use artificial intelligence to check all of those things, not to censor,
Right.
but you know, you could have a system of badges or something. Is this some kids sitting in their bedroom just trying to come off with fake stories with hot headlines that enable them to get traffic and make money, or is there some sign that this is from a news organization that has standards?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I mean, I have to say that the value of original journalism, investigative reporting, the painstaking work of you know, the Times recently did an investigation of Bill O'Reilly at Fox News. That took many months, was highly sensitive. You know, when it came out, I would say that you know, it was a surprise, actually, the reaction and how many advertisers decided that they were no longer going to advertise. But this is a sort of work that media organizations all over, especially under President Trump, we're investing in investigative journalists. We have reporters all around the world who are putting themselves in great danger to actually give voice to the powerless and care a lot about some rather unglamorous types of things. But there is a certain accountability and fact checking, I think, when you read something from a mainstream news organization that that you're just not going to get from many others. And I think that's really, really important to society. I'd also like to say, I mean, one of the reasons I came to the Times is that you are all in business, and I think that that they're very serious about, investing even more in business coverage, because business, and we have a businessman in the White House right now, and business in many ways is so much the center of what's happening in this economy and the world.
And I can say, you can't say this, I can say that even if business coverage has been a problem in the past, it won't be anymore because Rebecca's there. So there are a bunch of questions here, and we should probably take someone. I'll take this first one if you'll take the second one.
Okay.
The first one, yeah, no, I'm giving you the harder one.
Yeah.
The first one is, how has new media changed the way companies manage crises and or social involvement? I think that the change is huge, and you see it in the way that CEOs are responding. I mean, if just back up a step, if you think about the way companies used to work, they were basically information hierarchies. The information sort of rose up the hierarchy until it got to the top, and the C-suite had all the information, and they evaluated the information, and then they spread it back down the hierarchy to tell everybody what to do. Today, it's all horizontal. Everybody has the information anywhere. You can't control the spread of information. You can't limit the spread of information. Social media has made things that happen have such a huge and fast impact. I mean, look at this United...
Unbelievable.
It was unbelievable what they did, captured on video, spread to China within 12 hours. Massive, was the #1 trending social media story in China, where United's trying to establish a business. Just bang, like that. A single incident becomes a global phenomenon. And there are many, many examples of that. So it really requires a completely different approach to corporate leadership, and probably reinforces the importance of a values-based approach. Because you can't possibly control all the information and everything that's going on. And so you need to have confidence that the people who are working for you at least understand the values, because because they're going to be making things happen.
Yeah, just to add quickly to that, I mean, I think we are seeing this moment where business in many ways is more accountable than it's been at any time in the past. I mean, with Fox, with United, with Pepsi, and the controversial ad, we are seeing like in rapid fire reactions that would have been taken to committees and groups and such before, but in a sense, the broad, and then when you look at, Salesforce and, LGBT issues and, business is playing an increasingly active and responsive role in the world in fascinating ways.
And you can't segment audiences. I mean, part of what got Munoz into trouble was he had made his mark at United by settling labor disputes. He was very focused on employee dissatisfaction. And so his initial response to the horrible incident on the plane was to tell the employees, it's all right, this was a disruptive employee, what you were doing is understandable, but you can't tell the employees one thing and think that message isn't going to get out to the broader world, and people were outraged that he seemed to be suggesting that it had been handled appropriately.
Right. Okay,
You
the
wanna do that
harder,
one?
the harder
Yeah, you get the
second
hard
question
one.
here. Is the media partly to blame for the polarization of our country when it treats politics and policy discussions as a quote-unquote great show rather than an integral and serious part of our democracy? I would say, absolutely. I would argue that, media in general is certainly, bears some responsibility. I think you need to make distinctions. One can talk about CNN and the TV, exposure that a lot of the candidates, particularly President Trump, got over the course of the election when he was a candidate. There were many, even the Wall Street Journal, the Journal's editorial page, it was fascinating to watch, really went to war over, President Trump as a candidate. And then eventually embraced him. But I think you saw just the role of media just in this all the time context that really did play a role in the election. In terms of the more traditional journalists, I do think that, I'm from a town in the middle of the country in Michigan that went twice for Obama and just went for Trump. And I do think that and there's been a bunch of discussion about this, that the media kind of missed the story of what was happening in a lot of communities in the middle of the country that were hit by manufacturing losses and losses of jobs to China and the real economic uncertainty that a lot of communities are facing, thinking about what their kids are going to do and the cost of college and just this general insecurity that we have to write. So I think we need to earn the trust of readers and to write about issues that are really, really, bread and butter issues that are really relevant to their lives. And something like the healthcare debate now is just the latest such example. So I wouldn't try to run away from the blame, but I also think that it's not exactly fair to blame the media on the election, because believe me, the media wrote a lot of stories about all the candidates, especially Trump, and in the end,
and we can't
people didn't really care.
And we can't make people read.
Yeah.
It's some of the same tension that you've been talking about all day around the shared value notion. I mean, on the one hand, we're a business, and for us to write stories that no one reads is not going to make for a very good business. On the other hand, we have we feel a responsibility to inform, educate, provide a proper perspective. And there's a tension there, just as there is in many of the shared value issues that you've been talking about all day long.
I saw a question earlier about international, which we haven't touched on at all. And I just think it's interesting. There are fewer news organizations that are global in reach these days. And we are seeing, in so many parts of the world, I don't need to tell any of you that China is in many ways as much a local story as it is an Asia story. What's happening in North Korea, the role of the Russians in the election. You just, go down the list and they're all very relevant topics. I think that is a concern, and so what we try to do is bring international home to people and to the girls, the Boko Haram girls who were just freed in Nigeria, to kind of bring those stories and make them real with photos and visuals, and And as Alan says, we're trying all sorts of different ways of telling that story and getting readers interested. And a lot of them, a lot of them really do get a lot of traffic. The election in France is just the latest. We covered that, I would say, gavel to gavel, because it really had a lot of implications for the U.S. and obviously for Europe. So I think international and the connection, it's never been more important. It's never been more important to business. And obviously the trade relationship of the United States and the rest of the world is going to be an immense story, especially as we seem to be moving from trade, broad trade agreements to country by country. I think it's going to be really important that Americans know what's going on.
So are you seeing greater clicks on stories related to share value, purpose-driven businesses, or impact investing? I think the answer to that is clearly yes. I certainly, I know there's much more interest on the part of corporate leaders that I talk to, but also see more interest from readers as well. And some of it, there are a bunch of different reasons for it. Some of it comes from younger people who want to work at companies that they feel are doing good in the world. Some of it is a reaction to the 2007-2008 financial crisis and the decline in trust in business that occurred in the wake of that, and a feeling like, geez, we may be close to an existential crisis for business and capitalism, where we have to restore trust in order to maintain the ability to operate. So I think there are a bunch of different reasons driving it, but there's no question that interest is growing in my experience.
No, I think that's right. I think there's a demand for us to kind of grab some of the biggest issues of the day and to help sort them out and to have a debate about them. I mean, AI and the implication of jobs, driverless cars and the implication on jobs and the auto industry. It's just, we are in a massive time of political upheaval, of technological upheaval, and the implications are just vast. And we need to, we really need to distinguish ourselves by covering those in very sophisticated ways that can lead people to, feel like they understand them a level deeper. We need to help take the AI discussion from, AI versus jobs to like, how is this affecting different industries? How is it going to make some industries more competitive? We have to kind of take it to the next step, and that's very much our shared responsibility, because if we think, especially with these two technological trends, if this was a troubling election this time, the implications of those could be huge the next time around.
So what is the shared value strategy of Fortune and the Times? I'll take a stab at that first. I think Fortune, it's pretty clear. We've teamed up with Michael Porter and Mark Kramer to do the Change the World list, which shines a spotlight on companies that are actually making measurable progress in addressing social problems as part of their core business strategy. And we're using our convening power as well. That was what we did at the Vatican last December, to bring together 100 business leaders to focus on some of these issues. And we're going to be launching a new project called the CEO Initiative in September, which will also bring together a group of CEOs to focus on how business can be harnessed to address big social problems. The other thing I would say, I feel this about not just Fortune, but Time, in my responsibilities for Time Inc., just having a commitment to facts and to truth and to balanced reporting, which is part of your DNA, part of your company's DNA, part of my DNA, and part of our company's DNA. I mean, I take great pride in the fact, if you think about People, which is the biggest magazine at Time Inc., you walk into a grocery store, you've got 20 magazines at the checkout stand to choose from. There's National Enquirer, there's Us Weekly, and wild stories about, Jennifer Aniston, if you believe those covers, has had 37 pregnancies in the last 5 years, and at the Enquirer it can be babies landing from Mars. There's only one of those publications that you can really count on to get the story right. They won't do rumor, they wait until they get the story right, and that's People magazine. And I confess I'm not a lifelong People reader. My wife has been a lifelong People reader, but I'm really proud of the fact that we have that commitment to truth and accuracy and a willingness to wait to get the story right rather than to rush to print the rumor.
No, I would echo that. You know, the Times Is Ad campaign is truth is hard, and it really is hard. But I think that it's so important. It's more important than ever before. There are all sorts of different ways we are trying to engage, you know, across the country. We have a scholarship program where people have been generous donations. You know, we're giving out subscriptions to students. We've launched Snapchat. We did an event last week in Chicago on the Chicago shootings, where you do, you know, Times Live events around the country. Actually, that Chicago event was broadcast to college campuses around the country. We're trying to get in there both with live journalism, Alan, which you do so well, and in settings like this, just talking to people, but also, you know, reminding people, I think, of the ideals of journalism and its importance right now in holding the powerful to account. And I think there's never been a more important time. And I think we now feel that there's a window where we can prove our worth. I think people are actually giving us the benefit of the doubt, quite frankly. They're supporting journalism, and it's not easy, and we can't be reflexive. But if we do our jobs, I think we can get to, you know, hopefully a much better place with perhaps some cooperation from Facebook and Google.
So we got 45 seconds and 3 really tough questions. Do
Okay.
you want to? The third one is a directly aimed at you about how do you avoid the trap that an investigative story on Bill O'Reilly is dismissed as liberal media motivated?
Well, you know, that is a hard question. You know, I think that given what happened at Fox with Roger Ailes and the continued issues of sexual harassment, this is something that we, you know, that a reporter, Emily Steele, simply kept hearing about and kept investigating. You know, to be honest, it would have been an easier story had it have been, you know, a more liberal outlet. And we are asking, you know, we are committed to covering this issue, I would say, you know, not only at Fox, but elsewhere, because it's a surprising issue that in 2017 it exists to the extent that it is today. But I would say the fact that, you know, some might say the Times picking on, you know, a competitor, especially a more conservative one, is kind of uncomfortable. You know, that was what happened, but that's certainly not why, you know, you know, we did the investigation.
So I think that's it. We're out of time, and we're standing between you and your cocktail hour, which is a dangerous place to be. So, but thank you for giving us the time. Thank you, Justin. Good. Thanks very good. Thank you.